Welcome back to The Explainer. We're jumping straight into the geopolitical mechanics of the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987. And look, we're not just rehashing history here, we are completely dissecting the anatomy of decision-making. We're going to look at exactly how a localized internal crisis can rapidly spiral out of control and essentially force international intervention. So why does a local conflict suddenly gain massive regional importance? When you look at the maritime borders here, across the Indian Ocean between Sri Lanka and India, you have to ask yourself a fundamental question. What actually drives a neighboring power to step right into a highly volatile internal dispute? Like, how does violence on an island trigger this massive regional response? Well, to figure that out, we really have to look at the immense pressures building up on both sides of the water. Here's our roadmap for how domestic tension morphed into a full-blown regional crisis. First, we'll cover conflict escalation. Then, the humanitarian and strategic crisis. Number 3, India's decision matrix. 4, the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. And finally, the implementation and mandate shift. All right, Section 1, conflict escalation and the action-reaction consequence loop. You see, the momentum of this conflict really builds through a pretty tragic cycle of action, reaction, and severe consequences. It's basically a domino effect. It starts back in July 1983. The action, an LTTE attack on a Sri Lanka army patrol that kills 13 soldiers. The reaction to that is massive, sparking the Black July riots where Sinhalese civilians retaliated, which tragically included the slaughter of 53 Tamil prisoners at Wirlakata prison. And the consequence? Around 50,000 refugees fleeing, which really marks the start of the full-scale conflict. Then, fast forward to 1985, the action is India brokering peace talks at Thimphu. The reaction? The talks fail. Consequence? Fighting resumes, but with even greater intensity. By May 1987, the Sri Lankan army launches Operation Liberation. They corner the LTTE in Jaffna, and the reaction is cutting off all supplies to the besieged city. The consequence of that move is a massive, undeniable humanitarian crisis that literally could no longer be contained just within the island's borders. Moving on to Section 2, humanitarian and strategic crisis, looking at the pressures building on the ground. 1.2 lakh. That is 120,000 people. Think about that for a second. That is the number of Tamil refugees who had already fled across the sea to India because of the escalating violence. And this wasn't just a terrible tragedy for this displaced families. It placed an immense amount of domestic pressure directly on the Indian government. The crisis had officially crossed the maritime border. And because of that, India suddenly found itself caught in a truly terrifying strategic environment. It was about way more than just the refugees. Look at the internal pressures. You've got 50 million Tamils in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu who are deeply sympathizing with these refugees, and that is creating massive domestic political friction for New Delhi. But then, look at the external threats. The Sri Lankan government was desperate, battling the LTTE in the north and a totally separate Marxist JVB rebellion in the south. So they started seeking military assistance from the US, the UK, Israel, and Pakistan. Now, from India's perspective, this meant the potential introduction of foreign intelligence, foreign mercenaries, and possibly even foreign military bases, specifically at Trincomalee, right there on India's southern seaboard. It was an absolute direct threat to their regional security. Which brings us to Section 3. India's decision matrix, and how they weighed the costs of intervention. So put yourself in New Delhi's shoes. India's decision to intervene definitely wasn't some impulsive reaction. It was a highly calculated response balancing 4 crucial pillars. First up, security. India absolutely had to deter any powers inimical to its interests from establishing military bases in Sri Lanka. Second, politics. They had to pacify the centrifugal forces activating in Tamil Nadu just to prevent the ethnic crisis from spilling over their own borders. Third, humanitarian. The immediate severe suffering in Jaffna had to end. Actually, India was so concerned about this that when Sri Lanka initially ignored their requests to halt the offensive, India literally airdropped supplies directly to the besieged city in Operation Pumalai. And finally, regional stability. India genuinely feared a worst-case scenario where Sri Lanka might invite a hostile foreign military to intervene, or where the overstretched Sri Lankan military might just stage a coup. The whole island was basically on the brink of implosion. Let's look at Section 4, the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, and architecting a peace agreement. To try and resolve this massive, multi-layered crisis and pull the whole region back from the brink, Sri Lanka and India signed a peace accord on July 29, 1987. Now, this accord wasn't just some piece of paper, it was a systematic architecture of interconnected promises. Step 1. It guaranteed the unity and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka, basically trying to dissuade a purely military solution while protecting the state. Step 2, it officially acknowledged Sri Lanka as a multi-ethnic, plural society, recognizing the distinct cultural identities of all its people. Step 3, it offered administrative devolution by combining the northern and eastern provinces into one single unit with an elected council. Step 4 mandated a strict ceasefire, meaning Sri Lankan forces had to return to their pre-May 1987 barracks. And Step 5, militant groups had to surrender their arms. But, and this is a huge but, notice a critical detail here. The militant groups, including the LTTE, were not actually signatories. They only accepted it extremely reluctantly. And because of this, India became the official guarantor, stepping in to underwrite the entire agreement and provide the military assistance needed to implement it.
Now for Section 5, Implementation and Mandate Shift. What happens when strategy meets reality?
As you might guess, drafting a brilliant geopolitical agreement in a boardroom is very, very different from executing it on the ground in a conflict zone. The initial expectations were highly structured and honestly incredibly optimistic. The timeline said that within 48 hours of signing, all hostilities had to cease. Then, within 72 hours, militant groups were expected to completely surrender their weapons. And within just 3 months, a fully elected administrative council was supposed to take over governance in the provinces. I mean, it sounds like a perfectly neat linear blueprint for peace, right?
Well, that neat blueprint violently collided with reality. The initial mandate for the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF, was supposed to be simple. Just separate the warring groups, enforce the ceasefire, collect the handed-over weapons, and help the refugees go home. It was meant to be a straightforward peacekeeping and observation mission. But the emerging challenges changed literally everything. Because the militant groups only reluctantly accepted the accord, allegedly swayed by massive, unconfirmed financial and political assurances, tensions remained incredibly high. Very quickly, bloody fighting broke out again, and not just against the state, but among the Tamil militant factions themselves. That neat timeline we just talked about, it completely disintegrated. The IPKF was suddenly forced to dramatically shift its entire mandate. A heavy, highly complex fifth task was suddenly bolted onto their mission: maintain law and order. The peacekeepers essentially had to become enforcers. Wrapping up this explainer, we are left with a pretty sobering geopolitical lesson. Strategic objectives must align with political realities. The Indo-Sri Lanka Accord of 1987 proves how a domestic conflict, if left unchecked, will almost inevitably draw in regional powers through this messy combination of humanitarian disaster and strategic threat. But more than that, it highlights the incredibly dangerous friction between pristine diplomatic blueprints and the unpredictable, messy chaos of ground realities. So looking around the globe today, I'll leave you with this question to think about. What local conflict right now might escalate into tomorrow's regional crisis? And are the international peacekeepers actually prepared for the reality on the ground? Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the mechanics behind the headlines.